We can try. All right, first thing, just a quick announcement, bit of news item. So on your screen is going to be a save the date. The next World Water Congress, which is a major international global conference focusing on water issues, is going to be in Cancun, Mexico in May, June of 2017. I know this is a bit, down the road in terms of schedules, but I would strongly urge you to consider submitting abstracts and participating in this event. There will be student discounts as far as registration. If your employers can pay for this is great. If your grant can pay for this, wonderful. I have been given the distinct honor of, I will be the chair of the International Scientific Committee for this Congress. We will have somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 participants from all over the world. This is an event that happens every 3 years, and so it's a major deal. It's a great opportunity for collaboration, networking, meeting folks. We get a lot of the big water names, a lot of policy folks, a lot of government officials to come to these events. So if you're all inclined on staying in the water field, science, policy, law, management, engineering, hydraulics, hydrology, hydrogeology, any of those fields, this is all going to be featured at this event. If you have any questions, the website is, I don't think if you just go to World Water Congress, one word, .org, I believe, .com, there it is, worldwatercongress.com, you'll get to the website. The website just shows you this screen right now because it hasn't been fully updated. It will be updated probably in about a month, and we're going to start putting up information about how to submit abstracts and all the details. If anybody has any questions about participating, submitting, what the criteria will be, please shoot me an email. Let me know. As I said, I'll be chairing the scientific committee, and our job will be designing the content. We're going to be reviewing all the abstracts, accepting, rejecting, helping participants or submitters if they want to improve their abstract potential. Like I said, contact me. Because of my role here, because we have a number of board members at A&M, we're really hoping to get A&M highly involved in this particular Congress. So look for that over the next year. So again, if you have any questions about that, please let me know. So without further ado, we're going to go back to our regularly scheduled program. Start with Jordan Hartzell with green versus gray infrastructure. And I will put up the slides here. All right.
Hi, my name is Jordan Hartzell. I'm doing a presentation on irrigation water conservation / mainly infrastructure methods, and how people determine them in 3 different countries. The first thing is, you kind of need to know what green infrastructure is considered. One more. The more applicable definitions, the more modern ones. It's basically technologies that utilize and mimic natural hydrological cycle processes, like using evaporation and using soil and all this more natural processes as possible in the more industrial settings. A lot of communities are starting to do this in order to have healthier waters, and there's several environmental benefits, and can also be used to convert energy and help support sustainable communities. The next is gray infrastructure in comparison. Basically, it's the human-engineered solutions that involve the concrete and steel, like desalination plants, dams, the big things that have a large amount of concrete a large amount of steel and piping and things like that are all human engineered, that do not involve basically anything close to a natural process. Right now, this presentation is going to be going over 3 countries. One, China is currently implementing a lot of gray infrastructure, and the U.S. is actually gearing more towards green infrastructure, and then Germany, which is kind of doing a combination of the two. Next. This is a picture of China's current gray infrastructure project that's ongoing. Next. It's the South to North Water Diversion Project. The current plan is consisting of basically converting water from the southern regions to the northern, more dry, arid regions. There's 3 routes. This is the largest water diversion project that's ever been attempted in the world. It's going to link several different rivers. I cannot say the names of those, but you can see them up there. Like it says on the screen, it's diverting 44.8 billion cubic meters yearly. It's estimated to. I apologize. And it's going to cost about $62 billion. It began construction in 2002, expected to be completed in 2050, and so far only 1 route is done, and a picture on the left is a picture of the current route that is completed.
We have all the energy.
This is a map of the routes. In red shows the routes, and blue's obviously the rivers. So there's 3 different routes, and they're basically, like I said earlier, it's trying to connect rivers to get more water north. Next. And now the U.S. This is a picture of a green roof on it, on the background of the screen, excuse me. This is largely being implemented in New York. Next. Green roofs are basically an extension of an existing roof. They're built on top of already built roofs. Basically they can convert roofs into green roofs. It involves waterproofing and a water repellent system, a drainage system, and like a filter cloth. You can grow plants all over this, usually medium plants, and they're usually movable. And some of them have grids that interlock with each other, and the grids can be moved around as well in case you want to develop a different roof. If you want to take plants that are already built, you can take them from another roof, type of thing like that, purchase them. I'm assuming there's a purchasing system in New York because everything's expensive up there. So anyways, also downspout disconnections. There's a large movement of this in Portland, Oregon. It reroutes rooftop drainage pipes to rainwater permeable areas instead of storm sewers. Basically, it reroutes all this water coming off the roof to parks and like flower beds and things of that nature. Also, rain gardens is in New Jersey is a big deal, and it's all over Louisiana, especially after Katrina. This has become a big deal in flood areas. It's basically shallow vegetated basins that collect and absorb runoff from rooftops, sidewalks, and streets. And they do basically what green infrastructure does. They try to mimic natural hydrology as much as possible. And then finally, bioswales and permeable pavements. They're all over, and a lot of them are, excuse me, a lot of times these are built together because bioswales move stormwater from place to place, and they consist of vegetated and mulched channels. And the reason it's used with permeable pavements is because like medians and things of that nature that's usually close to sidewalks. Bioswales are usually close to sidewalks and parking lots and things of that nature. Permeable pavements are surfaces that infiltrate, treat, and or store rainwater where it falls. So basically, if the permeable pavements don't pick it up, the bioswales do. That's why these are a lot of times they're built together. Next. And then finally, Germany. Germany has been implementing green infrastructure since the late 70s. They got a really head start on everybody, essentially. They basically came up with the green roofs idea. From all my research, I found that they're the ones that coined it. I don't know who exactly, but they're the ones that have coined it and have implemented it the most, and permeable pavements. Since the beginning, the government's created an assortment of incentives and requirements at multiple levels because their government, which I will discuss later, has several different levels and essentially every level has some sort of incentive and requirement that leads to a more green infrastructure. Also, the federal nature protection laws and codes require restoration for human impairment. And the U.S. is kind of following their footsteps in this way. Like, we have to replace wetlands. Like, if we build on wetlands, we have to replace it. And it's essentially the same idea. If you destroy some sort of natural landscape in Germany, it's a federal requirement to fix it or account for it in some way. Next. Basically, Germany's just kind of trying to find new ways to conserve water and just new infrastructure technology in general, and so they've converted a little bit more back to gray lately. And the biggest thing is micro-tunneling. There are two basically this is big tunnels that go underneath the streets, and it's basically out of sight. There's 2 manholes required, so the construction doesn't stop traffic and it doesn't disturb life on the surface. This is planned a lot in some cities that do not have, that cannot have green roofs or can't have a lot of vegetation on the surface. These systems are a solution that allow the older systems to be rehabilitated, like some of the older piping and gray systems that were already in place. This is kind of just making them better. Next. This is the last little bit, what laws control the conservation and water methods in each country. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China and the other administrative water departments. Next. Article 26 of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China basically protects the environment, and it appoints administrative departments for the water research in local governments, saying basically it requires their governments to have some sort of department that controls water resources, and they're responsible for the management and the supervision over the water resources. Next. And obviously y'all are probably a lot more familiar with this, the state and local governments in the U.S. Several local and state governments decide what type of water infrastructure techniques to use throughout their respective areas. We have a lot of freedom between the local and state. Granted, there's very broad federal laws, but basically local and states can choose how they want to manage and construct their water infrastructure for the most part. We are getting to the point where there is a little bit more, I guess, going more green to where we are having to protect more areas as a federal requirement, but still, for the most part, it's still pretty free. I did want to mention the Army Corps of Engineers just because basically in the past they were used for a lot of large water projects like the Hoover Dam and things to that, can't think of my words.
Size.
To that size, yes, to that size. And but basically local and state, like the little water gardens and green roofs, that's all going to be local and state. Last is the German government. Next. Their government's a little confusing. Took a little bit to figure this out. But the federal level makes policies, which is similar to ours. They have a ministry for the environment and nature conservation. And the ministries and departments, within them they cooperate, but also Germany is made up of 16 federal states, and these states have council systems. And the council systems are responsible for the water management. So it's similar to kind of our state and local levels, because they do have local municipalities consisting of local administration. So it's similar to us locally being able to implement green roofs and things like that. But their larger, more larger projects are going to be by the ministry as opposed to federal, as opposed to state and local. Next. And now just the future trend of these 3 countries. Next. This is it. China's likely going to continue implementing the gray infrastructure, especially if this diversion project is determined to be successful, because even though it's expensive, that if it's successful, it's going to really help their northern regions. Hopefully the U.S. is going to continue going green. Right now, New York is the biggest place that green roofs are being implemented, and hopefully larger cities will catch on. And Germany, like I said earlier, is gearing a little bit more back towards gray. and they may continue to do so in the future. That's the way it's looking right now. That's it.
All right. Great. Any questions? All right. My quick question is, can you tell what's propelling any of these countries towards one or the other?
Mainly it's the past of what they already have. If you already have gray infrastructure, it's more apt that you're going to go towards green. But if you don't have infrastructure or a good infrastructure system, that you are more apt to go towards gray because it's easier first off, and you get more benefit from it from the get-go. As opposed to green, it takes a little bit for the economic and the physical benefits to kick in.
Okay.
That's from my research, that's what I've gathered.
Right. Any other questions? All right, we'll move on. Do we have Galveston online?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so, Mr. Christensen, you all ready?
Yes, sir. I sent you my presentation to be put up.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if it'll come out.
I apologize. It was a little bit later.
Yeah, it's trying to download it right now.
Okay.
Okay, and if somebody down in Galveston can help try to keep you to time?
Yes.
Great. Let's see. And just tell me when you want me to switch to the next slide.
All right. I'll be speaking today on the Ogallala Aquifer, its management and strategies in comparison to the international aquifer management. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, we're getting some pretty bad feedback here. Maybe if I scoot back.
There, no, it's okay. We'll turn our mic off.
Yeah.
Okay, that's better.
There you go. Sorry. All right. Today I'll be talking about the Ogallala Aquifer and its management strategies and comparing them to international aquifer management. Next slide, please. So the purpose of my research was to seek out solutions for the depleting groundwater in the Ogallala Aquifer. So the main issue with the Ogallala Aquifer water levels is agriculture. Irrigation is the main culprit for depleting the groundwater in that area, especially in Texas, in the Panhandle and the South Plains. So I'm going to seek solutions to eliminate our over-exploitation of the aquifer, or at least seek to slow it. I also looked to find a research question among solutions. So here's some basic aquifer information, so everyone will at least know where I'm coming from. So as you can see on the next slide, there's an unsaturated zone above the water table and a saturated zone, which is essentially the aquifer. Different porosities in different aquifers allow for different recharge rates, and with the Ogallala, it's a sandstone and gravel aquifer, and the recharge rates are rather slow. Next slide, please. So the next way to look at an aquifer is a water-bearing rock that readily transmits water from wells and springs, or to wells and springs, excuse me. And as I said before, recharge is when water is being added via the porous rock. And so our main issue, again, is irrigation from wells that are pumping at a higher rate than the recharge rate as of now, causing depletion. Next slide, please. The Ogallala Aquifer underlies South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and that's supposed to say Texas. It is characterized again as a shallow, unconsolidated gravel aquifer, and 30% of the groundwater from the Ogallala is used for irrigation, or 30% of all of the groundwater used for irrigation in the U.S. comes from the Ogallala. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show a map of the Ogallala and how it underlies all of the states. Next slide, please. So as I've stated, we are experiencing depletion in the aquifer, and that depletion results in certain detriments. So we have reduced recharge due to clay strata forming, which is also known as the cap rock in that area. The ecological consequences are a loss of stream flow and riparian habitats, and also from a biological standpoint, we're losing wintering and nesting areas along the North American Central Flyway. Next slide, please. So as I was doing research, Kansas State came out with a study comparing oil to groundwater, and using the Hubbert curve to show how overproduction on one side due to discovery and infrastructure is causing a decline on the backside. Next slide, please. So in this slide you can see kind of how the Hubbert peak theory works. You have high production, and then you reach a peak, and on the backside of that you reach production declines because of resource depletion. And Kansas State has used this model to model groundwater in the Ogallala. So here's a slide showing just a more intense look at what I just said. Essentially, the resource is used to peak depletion point, and then after that, it can only be used at a significantly decreased rate due to depletion. Next slide. One more, please. So peak water depletion has already occurred for Kansas, New Mexico, and Texas. It's trending to occur in 2023, and peaks have not yet occurred for Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And next slide, please. So here is a diagram showing saturated thickness levels from 1930 to 2110, just going with the trends that we're seeing now. And as you can see in the southern portion where Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma are, Oklahoma's not doing too terribly, but you can see significantly lower levels in saturated thickness in Texas, especially. Next slide, please. So knowing that we have overexploited the Ogallala, certain organizations are taking steps to improve this, especially in Texas. The NRCS has created the Ogallala Aquifer Initiative. Their goal is to reduce the amount of water removed and improve the quality of water being removed. And they want to do this by conserving via irrigation efficiency, improving water quality, promoting groundwater recharge, convert marginal irrigated land to dry land farming, which means it won't be irrigated, and they also want to increase river flow. Next slide, please. Their concerns are mainly for water quality because this results in higher costs and more management problems for farmers especially. And because of lower water levels, we're seeing nutrients and pesticides in higher quantities in our water on the Ogallala. Next slide, please. So the Ogallala Aquifer Initiative, or OAI, has seen successes, but they're mostly financial and in some ways reducing water. But we're still not at a point where we can say that we're even getting close to balancing out irrigation water and recharge rates. So as you can see, they reduced water withdrawals from the Ogallala by at least 1.5 million acre feet, which sounds like a lot, but it's still not enough. These practices are due to reduce irrigation energy needs. Oh, and they also reduce irrigation energy needs by 33 million gallons of diesel fuel. Next slide, please. So to compare to international aquifer issues, I wanted to look at another agrarian economy, which leads us to the Gujarat state, and the aquifers that underlie it. In 2000, 31 of the 184 sub-districts or talukas were drawing more groundwater than annual recharge could replace, and they started experiencing high fluoride levels and salinity levels in their water. So they thought that managed aquifer recharge was a possible solution. And aquifer recharge, or artificial aquifer recharge, which is putting water artificially back into the aquifer. Next slide, please. So what they experienced and found out is that artificial recharge was not a viable option to affect depletion. And that was figured out early on, and they also found out that more importantly than trying to operate artificial recharge was just getting collaboration from stakeholders. And I think this reflects well with Texas because there are a lot of stakeholders there, especially the farmers, that would have to work together to make large changes in the area. And if you know anything about West Texas farmers, they grow cotton, and that's usually because Daddy did, which isn't a good enough reason to continue using a crop that isn't drought tolerant. But to go on, next slide, please. So artificial recharge was tested in the Ogallala in Texas, and it was this research was done by the USGS, and they determined that it wasn't compatible due to the capacity of. We were unable to. I'm sorry. It wasn't a good idea because we had the inability to determine the capacity of the aquifers to accept recharge, distribution of recharge water, and the placement of injected sediment, which is an issue especially with the clays in the area. It was also decided that construction of the recharge well and injection systems were less critical than the character of the aquifer system. So essentially, the wells and injection system did not matter as much as what the aquifer was made of. But treatment of the water to reduce sediment load would have helped in the situation. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show in this slide the results of the study. They used 4 wells to test aquifer recharge, artificial recharge, and as you can see, one had significant decreases in permeability. Injected water discharge at the surface wasn't perched and not available for pumping. And in one of them, they actually saw an increase in productivity, and the last one, they didn't see any positive effects. Next slide, please. Okay. So next I'd like to move to the Gaza Strip aquifer system. This is located in Palestine and bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. This system is also a sandstone aquifer system with a water table approximately 1 meter below sea level. So they ended up experiencing a lot of salinity infiltration due to the sea. Next slide, please. And you guys just skip to the next one that says irrigation metering. So in Texas, we have a system that is voluntary through the Texas Water Development Board, where people are getting meters and they're able to track their irrigation, and it's backed financially to help create a positive view of conservation. Next slide, please. I wanted to add that Gaza used governmental action to slow agricultural water use, and though it's probably not a good idea to try to tell farmers exactly what the exact amounts of water they can use for irrigation, it's got to be considered as a management action because I guess it technically could be done. The way the government stopped water to the farmers in the area of the Gaza Strip was Mercarot. Next slide, please. This is the Israeli National Water Company. They have 70 years of water management, and they're entrusted with providing water to a very rapidly growing population. And they have started using water tariffs to control rates and water that everyone is receiving. Next slide, please. So in my search, I've found that more often than not, management strategies are highly connected to the people using the water, especially farmers in this instance. And I have a research question seeking the possibility of growing cotton in its original subtropical regions and possibly transferring the cotton dominance from the South Plains to a more drought-tolerant crop, such as corn or another kind. So these results would need to include the quality of the crop, the quantity or the yields, and the marketability of the harvested crop. This would also take scientists, politicians, and economists, as well as the farmers, to get together and work together. And I think that would be the most difficult part of the process. But it's a possibility, and I just would like to explore that further and see if there could be a trial place somewhere just in a small area to see if it could be moved to a large scale. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question here in College Station. When you were looking at the artificial recharge, was that just injecting the water, or were they also recovering from the same well?
That was just injecting. No, I think that was recovering the water and putting it. I think they were recovering it as well, and that's where they were running into issues with sedimentation.
Okay. Because I've looked at methods of aquifer storage and recovery, and I was wondering if it was the same thing, or if this was just artificial recharge.
This specifically was just artificial recharge, as far as I know.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right, we'll move on to Mr. Russo.
Okay, good evening. My name is Nick Russo, and I'm going to be talking about analysis of treaty agreements for managing transboundary wetlands. There's a couple that we're going to focus on today, one being the Sudd in Africa, the second being the Pantanal in South America. This project really begs the question, do we care about wetlands? We may care about them locally, even nationally. We can debate that, look at what's happening in the U.S. With regards to what is a water of the U.S. But even internationally, do we care about them? And I think we can all agree that in some cases we do value them, but they're not necessarily off limits to anybody. And surely we would not destroy the world's largest wetlands, would we? But study after study demonstrates that wetlands areas and quality continue to decline in most regions of the world. So let's talk about what mechanisms there are to protect wetlands, and then what are their threats. On the protection side, we may have regulations and policies in a country. We may also set aside land for parks and preserves. We're going to talk about the Ramsar Convention that may offer some protection, and obviously treaties between countries and the political will to enact those policies for conservation. The threats in these areas include land development, population growth, economic development, climate change, and I would argue the same political will that may offer them protection. So international wetlands, what are they? The Ramsar Convention definition is very broad and includes all lakes and rivers, underground aquifers, and then even the traditional swamps and marshes and wet areas that you would think of. It also includes all human-made sites such as ponds, rice paddies, reservoirs, and salt pans. So it's very broad. But the Ramsar Convention is actually the convention on wetlands of international importance, specifically geared toward waterfowl habitat. It was an intergovernmental treaty that promoted the wise use and conservation of wetlands that became effect in 1975. And the Ramsar Convention has 3 pillars of action. These include wise use of wetlands, their designation and management of wetlands, and international cooperation for wetland conservation. And so this treaty works by each contracting party to the treaty designating one or more wetland sites to be included in the list. There are 9 criteria for listing, of which for a wetland to be listed, it must meet 1. And I'm not going to read all these, but most of them have to do with a wetland site being very unique, supporting large populations of animal species, 20,000 or more water birds, and significant other unique species. In Ramsar sites, you can see their distribution all over the world. There's 169 contracting parties. There's over 2,000 Ramsar sites covering more than 214 million hectares of land. And there's very few recognized transboundary wetland sites. So contracting parties can establish sites as part of a transboundary Ramsar site where both sides of the wetland agree to proper management or even notifying each other of significant changes. The problem here is that there's only 13. Most of these occur in Europe and a couple in Asia. So there's very few. So let's talk about the Sudd. The Sudd is located in South Sudan in the Nile River Basin. The Sudd borders Sudan and is closely related to water issues among the other riparian countries of the Nile, which one of our case studies for the other project was the Nile River Basin. You can see the Sudd here on the Nile River Basin map where the yellow star is, and then a closer view of South Sudan and the very large wetland area that is there. The Sudd is one of the largest tropical wetlands in the world, spanning 57,000 square kilometers. There's over 350 plant species, 100 million species, and the list goes on and on. It's a very unique area. It's home to 2 great migrations. Over 1 million antelopes is one of the largest migrations of land animals in the world that travel among a few park sites that are in the Sudd. And so when we look at what is actually protecting the Sudd, it is a Ramsar site. It does have several national parks as well as other game reserves. And we spoke about the Nile Basin Initiative among the other countries that are in the Nile Basin. And environmental issues are advocated by the Nile Basin Initiative in the region, which is a good thing. The threats to the Sudd are that the Sudd wetlands hold great economic potential for the Nile Basin and South Sudan. And in terms of water resources conservation projects, this is a very controversial issue in the Nile region. You can see the other countries here that border the Nile, Egypt obviously at the mouth. But 50% of the White Nile flow evaporates when passing through the Sudd, and that ends up being about 16 billion cubic meters per year. So That's not a little bit of water, that's a ton of water, and the other countries here really eye that. So there was a project in the Nile region called the Jonglei Canal Project that is about half constructed, and that's really one of the largest threats to the Sudd in the region. Let's talk about the Pantanal. The Pantanal is in South America. It is, again, a lot of these you read them and they say this one's the largest tropical wetland. Well, I think the Pantanal is actually the largest tropical wetland. So this one spans over 140,000 square kilometers. I found a couple of different estimates for that, but we'll go with 140,000. It's in the Paraguay River Basin. About 80% of it is in Brazil, and the rest is in Bolivia and Paraguay. For Pantanal Protection, both Brazil and Bolivia have nominated it or listed it as a Ramsar site. It does not fall into that category that I showed you before of the international transboundary wetland site, but both of them have separate Ramsar designations. But only 5% of this Pantanal is actually protected. Some of the threats are that agricultural developments from ranching are encroaching into the area. Hydroelectric power plants in South America are big, and these hydroelectric plants have modified the flood pulses. And the Pantanal is home to, again, numerous plant and animal species, threatened wildlife. It's home to the blue hyacinth macaw, shown here, which is an endangered species, not to be confused with the parrot from Rio, which is a different one, I learned. So there are threats to the area, but the most significant threat is actually the Paraguay Piranha hydrovia, which is a plan by the 5 countries in the region in the La Plata Basin to convert or channelize the Paraguay and Pantanal rivers into an industrial shipping channel. So the issue here really is transportation and commerce in the region, which is a great threat to this significant ecosystem. So scientists have predicted that the channelization of the river would cause the wetland to shrink with numerous impacts to the environment. So the summary here is that there's very few recognized transboundary wetlands. Treaties such as Ramsar and international agreements between countries may help protect these ecosystems. However, those same or different agreements for water projects between countries may not actually fully protect the same wetland environments. With that, I'll take any questions you have.
Questions?
Yes.
You said that 13 countries are part of the Ramsar Convention?
No. There's 13 countries that have officially recognized transboundary wetlands. So the countries there have agreed in the Ramsar Convention that they share and operate the site. There's only 13 of those. There are.
You know by any chance which countries are part of the Ramsar Convention?
Yes, there are 169 parties to the Ramsar Convention. The U.S. is a party. You can see dots in North America. Look at all the dots in Mexico and even going into Central and South America, as well as Europe. There are a number of sites that are in Europe and Africa. But we don't have any in North America that are recognized transboundary wetlands. Hope I answered your question.
Any others?
Okay.
Thank you. All right. We'll now move on to Brendan Mitchell here in Fort Worth.
All right, guys, bear with me because I'm a little sick and still coughing. But as soon as my slides come up here. There we go. So my research topic was attacking an enemy's water supply during an armed conflict or time of war, and whether or not doing so crosses the international boundary of the laws of war and or humanitarian law. Next slide. So to start out with, we look at water itself, and of course water is the basis of all life. It's essential to human, animal, and agricultural survival around the globe. It's essential to survival of different cultures. Different cultures rely on it for their religious practices in different regions all around the world. And then, of course, any region's overall economy and success of industry is highly dependable on freshwater supplies. Next slide. So then we look further into the necessity of water as it's associated with war itself. And it's by far our biggest necessity is the hydration of troops, especially in the combat theaters that we find ourselves in today over the desert with the much heavier body armor and equipment that the troops are carrying on a daily basis. But it's also very essential to the operation of weapons, to both clean them to keep them in operation, as well as some weapons use water to, like water-cooled machine guns. And then, of course, to transport supplies and troops up and down riverways. And then medical aid for both combatants and civilian casualties throughout war. Next slide. So some of the potential strategic targets that we look at include dams, dikes, water treatment stations, pumping stations, storage reservoirs, water distribution networks, both stationary and mobile, and that includes water resupply trucks to both ourselves as well as the enemy combatants, water resupply to villages for the civilian populations, and then the water storage bladders, and also they're known as pillow tanks. They're basically just massive rubber blobs that hold thousands of gallons of water for supply over in the desert. Next slide. So we look at that, and then we try to look at a hypothetical terror attack here, and just to put it in some perspective, how easy it is to use water against an enemy. And there was a study done, which you'll see here in a minute, from the United States Air Force, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and the University of Colorado, in which they took a major metropolitan city, somewhat resembles Houston, Texas. It had a massive population, which Houston holds a 6.5 million person population roughly. And the method that they chose was that a terrorist organization wanted to use a backflow method, and that occurs whenever a pump is used to overcome a pressure gradient that is present in the distribution system's pipes. In order to do so, they can find these supplies at any home improvement store like Home Depot, Lowe's, and they can just rent the pumps, purchase any chemicals or pesticides that are toxic enough, and as long as they purchase them in small amounts, they can go to multiple stores and get what they need, and they can do this from inside their home. In the hypothetical that I researched, they did it from inside of a rental resident in a major metropolitan city. So once the pressure gradient's been overcome with using the pump, the poison's introduced, and then it becomes a siphoning effect, and then once it's siphoned into the pipelines, the water pressure just carries it through the pipes, and basically the study shows, if you go to the next slide, that if it's calculated correctly, a few gallons of poison properly put into the water supply infrastructure could easily contaminate the water and hit roughly 100,000 people within a matter of hours. The estimated cost to carry out such an attack would be between 5 cents and $5 per death, which, weighing the cost of war, it's extremely efficient if you're on the aggressor side. Next slide. So we looked at the hypothetical. Now we look at some things that have actually taken place in the United States, which were accidental contaminations, had nothing to do with terrorist organizations or any other state military militia. So the EPA did a study and found 57 different disease outbreaks, 9,734 cases of waterborne disease between the years of 1981 and 1998, just here within the United States. These were accidental backflows, and in 1993, there was a big outbreak of cryptosporidium in Milwaukee that killed roughly 100 people and affected the health of roughly 400,000 more. So when you look at that compared to the hypothetical, you can see that it's definitely a real threat, even in today's society with all the technology we have. Next slide. So we look at a couple more events going back through history. And this is somewhat of a new topic because there weren't a lot of records kept until really around Vietnam era. But we look at Yugoslavia back in the 1990s for the NATO bombings in Kosovo. So when the NATO forces bombed, they knew it was going to affect the water supply somewhat, but it was basically necessary to continue the bombings anyway. And so it caused depleted freshwater resources, which caused emergency conditions amongst the civilian population, and it lasted up to a year after the bombings. And then move forward to today in Afghanistan, we had the U.S. and Allied forces. Of course, more predictable damage with the necessary bombings, but they caused massive damage to the water supply infrastructure around the city of Kabul. And then what was left of it was pretty much torn down and sold off for excess finance from the rebel fighters to finance their war effort, which left roughly 30% of the homes in Kabul being the only homes that had access to water, and that's a city that holds roughly 1 million in population. And then the little bit of research I was able to find going back to World War II, first we'll do England, where they actually bombed a lot of the dams in Germany to disrupt the building of the war effort, basically, the building of bombs, building of planes, building of tanks that were going on in factories down the river. And then Japan, actually, they wanted to set up a program where they were studying the biological effects by contaminating water, so they chose to contaminate nearly 1,000 freshwater wells amongst different Chinese villages, which there's no actual amount as far as lives go that were killed or lost, but it's estimated to have been in the tens of thousands. Next slide. So we looked at the international law that we currently have on the books now that's supposed to help protect against this. And one, we go back to 1907 and the Hague Convention. And Article 23, as you can see on the screen, states that it's forbidden to destroy or seize the enemy's property unless imperatively demanded by necessities of war. So you look at Kosovo and you look at Afghanistan, the bombings were necessary for the war effort, and it was pretty much collateral damage. But then you look at Japan and you look at England. England could kind of go either way, whether or not they actually killed civilians downstream by bombing the dams and massive amounts of flooding. There's really no evidence of it, or no documentation rather. But as far as Japan goes, there was clearly a violation of the Hague Convention. And then you go to the Geneva Convention of 1949 and additional protocols 1 and 2 back in the 1970s. And so they are protecting more against the water supply, even though it's not stated per se in the actual convention. But it's willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to a body or health. And they also prohibit the extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity, which links back to the Hague, and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, much like Japan did. So, like it says on the screen there, it's widely considered to include the water facilities, but it doesn't say it per se. Then you have international humanitarian law, which, excuse me, which is basically public policy that's been adopted by majority of international states. Next slide. And then we look to the punishment that can take place for a state or individual that goes against these conventions or the international humanitarian law. And within the United States, if we can classify someone as a state combatant or an alien unauthorized enemy combatant, which would be fighters such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, then we can try them by military tribunal, which is separate from an actual court-martial, but they're still tried under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And then on the international level, we have the International Criminal Court, which is based off the Rome Statute, which I don't have here on the slide, but it is separate from the World Court because, like we talked about earlier in the semester, the World Court is more of a voluntary court to go in front of, whereas the International Criminal Court, they can bring you in front of it. Kind of like the Nuremberg trials. And then, so the ICC, like I said, was created on the Rome Statute, adopted in Rome, Italy in 1998, and all members of the European Union and North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, are parties to the ICC with the exception of the United States and Turkey. And the way I understood that in my research was basically the United States, if they have someone within their command that's being accused of an international war crime or an enemy combatant that they've captured on the battlefield, they don't want the International Criminal Court to have the first crack at them, but they still hold jurisdiction because it happened in a foreign land. So the U.S. will try them either by court-martial if they're within the ranks or by military tribunal if they're not in the ranks. And then if they don't get it there, then the ICC has a crack at them. And as far as Turkey goes, I couldn't find a whole lot of research on that. So with that being said, any questions?
Any questions? Yeah.
Do you know of any type of monitoring system in the U.S. that monitors water for contamination?
The FBI talked about it a little bit in my research. They do have an actual section of the FBI that's set up to monitor weapons of mass destruction, which they consider contamination of water to be that. And they say that it's not a very viable threat for most metropolitan cities due to the fact that the water infrastructure is kind of broken up and they can cut it off within a short time. Also, they can increase the chlorination in the water, which anytime the chlorination level starts to fall, it shows that there's some type of bacteria or something that shouldn't be in the water. So they have that, and also recently in Paris, right after the terrorist attacks 2 weeks ago, they had credible threats after some materials were stolen from a local hospital, including Ebola virus. And so they had credible threats against their water supply there, and they're on active alert. Any more questions?
All right. Thank you. We'll go to College Station and Miss Hassan.
Hi, my name is Assa Hassan, and I'll be presenting today about groundwater in the Nile River Basin and the proposal for the management framework. For the outline of the presentation, we will have an overview of the groundwater in the basin, followed by the brief introduction of the Cooperative Framework Agreement, also known as the NTB Agreement. Then we will take a look at the structure and function of the Nile Basin Initiative and compare it to the Nile River Basin Commission, which will take over the duties of the Nile Basin Initiative once the agreement is put into force, closing with the proposal for managing the basin's groundwater resources by establishing the Groundwater Committee and defining the objectives and function. The groundwater in most of the Nile Basin countries is either the main source for fresh water or is needed to supplement surface water resources. The current rates of pumping are insignificant compared to the available storage, but that is changing with time and the dependence on groundwater is increasing. Here we have a map, a diagram showing the transboundary aquifers shared between the Nile Basin states and other African countries, like the Nubian sandstone aquifer, which is shared between Sudan, Egypt, Libya, and Chad. It is the only aquifer in the system that have an agreement regarding extraction management, and it is already extensively pumped. The available information about the aquifer is old and need to be updated. We have other deep and shallow aquifers in the system, which are not extensively used or studied due to the abundance of surface water in the area like Lake Victoria, Artesian Basin in Ethiopia. The current issue in the basin is scarcity of virgin groundwater information and insufficient understanding of the aquifer system, causing a major issue of pollution in almost all of the riparian states due to the inadequate capacity for monitoring both surface and groundwater qualities across the basin, with some variation between countries. In addition to the fact that there is no legal or management framework directly addressing groundwater in the basin. When preparation and negotiation of the Cooperative Framework Agreement started in 1999, it was the first attempt to have all riparian states under one governing framework. Here we have a table showing the detailed stages of preparation, which ultimately led to the establishment of the agreement and have it signed by the upper riparian states, creating further tension between them on one hand, and Egypt and Sudan on the other hand, resulting in having 30% of the area and more than 40% of the population of the basin outside of the limits of the agreement's limits. There are a number of reasons experts are stressing on trying to get Egypt and Sudan join the agreement. Some of them related to the UN Convention of the Use of International Water Courses, and others are directly concerned with the best interest of the basin. At the beginning of the preparation for the agreement of the Nile Basin Initiative, the Nile Basin Initiative was created with socio-economic goals, and it is a very successful partnership, but it was meant to be an interim system serving until the final establishment of the Commission. The Nile Basin Initiative have the Council of Ministers of Water Affairs of each riparian state, the Technical Advisory Committee, which is concerned with the development of the basin's resources, the administrative section, as well as some subsidiary programs that have the objective of training and human development, which is an essential element for the management framework to be proposed. The initiative is funded through contribution from member states and other donors' trust fund. Nile River Basin Commission, which will take over the Nile Basin Initiative duties once the agreement put into force, is implementing the principle of community of interest use of international water courses. The structure of the Nile River Basin Commission is different than the Nile Basin Initiative in that the Commission has two extra elements, which are the Conference of Heads of the States, since it's a permanent institute for managing the system, and the sectorial advisory, which will be assigned specific duties as needed. One significant addition to the system is the National Nile Focal Point Institutes, developed by each state to help coordinating with the Commission. The proposed management framework will start with creating groundwater committee under the Technical Advisory Committee, which entitled by the article of the agreement to create subdivisions handling certain duties. The Groundwater Committee functions are supervision, monitoring, and protection of the basin's aquifer. It comprises of 2 members from each Nile Basin state, selected by their governments. One of them is a hydrogeologist, and the other is a senior official. Any other suggested experts are allowed in the meetings as needed. The chairperson of the committee will be selected or nominated by the committee members and will serve for a period of 2 years. The Groundwater Committee will be funded through the Commission funding channels. Groundwater management process will be carried out in 2 phases, starting with conducting researches and studies to collect and assess all aquifers relevant data in order to build a database system for them. The data include the aquifer characteristics, recharge and discharge points, and pollution. Since it is the major concern, special attention will be given to that category by categorizing locations by degrees and types of pollutions, identifying methods of treatment and deadlines to reach the intended quality. No wells construction is allowed during this phase. Phase 2 will follow the groundwater management functions of regulation, planning and control, monitoring and protection, incentives and education and capacity building. And the regulation part will define the extraction guidelines as well as the permit granting system. in which each state will be responsible of determining the threshold of volume, depth, and use of its groundwater according to the reasonable and equitable use principle, and the aquifer database system open to all states, within 3 levels. Level 1, extraction volumes which are small enough to be exempt from requesting a permit for pumping, but a notification is still required for that. Level 2, which will have the locations, depth, and types of uses above that threshold that requires a permit. And then the last level, which is the category in which the users have to purchase rights for uses, especially when they are pumping from non-recharging aquifer, where these charges will be directed towards developing artificial recharge techniques. Rights might be lost or suspended in case they were abandoned or if the users are not complying with the guidelines, and the limits of each level will be subject to change in case of aquifer stress. In the planning part, it will start with the treatment of the aquifer, since it is the most important issue currently, in terms of defining the methods of treatment, progress, and the deadlines. Supervision of the planning process will depend on the annual reports from the riparian states with summary of its system in that year and the intended plans for the following year. The committee will revise the reports and reply with recommendation, offer incentives in case of compliance, or request the states to comply. The planning system should have a confining effect on the permitting system, in which if there is a contrast between them, the planning system can request to have the permit cancelled or altered, and compensation is offered for the users. For the aquifer protection, previous suggestions include adding protection clauses to the Cooperative Framework Agreement articles, or establishing a separate protection law for the basin's groundwater. In general, underground wastewater discharge or storage would be prohibited. Land zoning and extra protection would be offered to the recharge points, as well as conducting or adopting the best available techniques for monitoring groundwater qualities and the aquifer condition. Incentives will be offered, only positive incentives will be offered, and that is going to be in 2 levels. Level 1 from the Commission to the states in forms of coordination for external investments, for example, with the Arab Gulf area, and with assistance in building infrastructure and modernization in general. Second level of incentives will be offered from the government to their nationals. The notification category in the permit system was one of those incentives, as well as discounts and in payments and exemption from taxes. Negative incentives shall be avoided as possible, otherwise it will be in forms of loss of the right or suspension, reduction in allowed extraction volumes, or penalty fees. Educating locals about groundwater systems and protection methods, training them on new pumping techniques, as well as promoting good social environment, especially between in locations where Arab and African tribes coexist, is the responsibility of the Focal Point Institute and the Nile Basin Discourse. Lastly, the system ultimate goal is creating a conjunctive surface and groundwater management system, and states are encouraged to establish individual, more detailed agreements for shared aquifers according to the terms and conditions of the Cooperative Framework Agreement. Thank you.
Any questions? Have any of the countries in the Nile Basin made any efforts to develop any cooperative agreements under this framework for a transboundary aquifer?
Under the Nile River Basin Commission, not yet, since it's not like
Right.
a general thing yet, because Egypt and Sudan haven't joined yet. But there is the previous attempt of having the extraction management of the Nubian sandstone aquifer.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right, we'll move on to Mr. Dolezal.
Okay. Well, that is, it's funny that that presentation was before me because now I can actually introduce you to the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer Treaty. I'm going to explain the characteristics of the aquifer as well as the states surrounding the aquifer and their stake in the aquifer. There's agreement proposed between the 4 countries of this aquifer, and after I'm going to discuss after I discuss their stake, I'm going to compare and develop a strategy for the future proposed. So we have Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan around the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer system. Egypt, obviously the largest country in the matter. I also wanted to give a chart. I give a few charts in this discussion. Just giving basically, who's got their stake over the aquifer and in what instances. Basically, there's a matter of what land is over the aquifer and how much water is under that land. So the first chart discusses Egypt having 38%, followed by Libya, Sudan, and Chad. And here are the sources of the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer system. The Nile River, Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea, and Lake Chad. Lake Chad is pretty much an outlier at this point. It's quite far away from the aquifer itself, but studies haven't shown for it to be canceled out, I guess. So the multilateral agreement was in 2013. It was a UN-supported agreement between the 4 countries. All 4 countries wanted to coordinate on groundwater pumping, as well as improve the country's ability to monitor the withdrawals. And overall, they wanted to develop a sustainable development for the aquifer. That was in 2013. In 2015, Libya's officials straight up did not show up to the meeting. They opted out. Basically, now the agreement is up for grabs. We don't know if they're going to continue with a multilateral agreement. Basically, Libya has chose to take their direction solo. I won't go into this too much, but another action that's taken place is ISIS forces are attempting to take over vulnerable states of Libya's developments, and I think that might be why Libya has opted out. Some more characteristics on the aquifer. It ranges from 150 million cubic meters to 8.8 trillion. The reason this varies so much is basically there's just not enough studies yet to determine a more, I guess, exact approximate amount. I know those two are contradicted, but it's quite a big variability between the two still. The area of this aquifer is 4 times the size of Texas. People assume Texas is a great large state, and this aquifer is 4 times the size of that. The recharge rate of this aquifer is quoted a fossil aquifer. Basically, the extraction rate of this aquifer is going to deplete this resource as soon as maybe at the end of the century. It's really unknown just because of really the unknown volumes of the aquifer. As it says, 150 to 8.8 trillion. That's a big difference in how much can we draw from this resource for how long. We know this because we know that it's a fossil aquifer because the radiocarbon dating is anywhere from 100,000 years to 1 million years, and in deeper zones there 2 million. So the water in this area is very old, and it is due to the climate in the area. It's got a very low recharge rate. Now I'm going to go into what each state and their stakes. It's very hard to say those two together, but what their stakes are in this aquifer. The first graph shows the percentage of land over the Nubian sandstone aquifer system. Chad's is 11%, with the others being 89%. They have 12.8 million people. It's, I believe, the second lowest of the four. Sparsely populated, and they do not have the technological and economical finances and requirements that are needed to really take over this resource or provide for it. And the other chart is the available percentage of fresh water of the Nubian sandstone aquifer. So the other chart is basically saying what part of this aquifer, because it's very brackish in some parts and it's very good quality in other parts. So there's only 12.8 for Chad, 12.8%. Egypt's is 38% of the land over the sandstone aquifer. 38% of it is in Egypt, and what is available for Egypt is 41%. And I will bring this up later because this is going to cause a big discussion between who gets what. But as I like to point out, 93% of the water demand is from the Nile. 7% of this nation's water demand is from groundwater, and 1.2% of that 7% groundwater demand is from this aquifer. 1.2%. So it's available to them, as you see, 38% under the land and 41% of the fresh water. It's very available to this nation, but they're more focused on the surface water. Sudan's 38 million people, very large compared to other other two. They have more emphasis on the Nile-Nubian basin. The reason is because they have 9% of available freshwater resources to that aquifer. The land, again, is 17% over it, but the 9% is the emphasized number here. And I think because of that is why they emphasize the Nile-Nubian basin for their water demand. Libya, the last nation, is the smallest nation. But what's funny about their stake is they draw the absolute most from this resource. And they do this through their, their baby, their prize, their one and only in the world, the Great Man-Made River Project. And I'll go into that a little bit further, but 95% of this demand is met by groundwater. They do have the less amount of people, but as you can see, 34% of the land is over the aquifer, and available freshwater resources is 36%, pretty good percentage. So Libya's Great Man-Made River project, I won't go into too much emphasis, but it's such a outstanding development in today's water development goals, or water development, that I just want to briefly go over it. Started in the 60s, it's planned to cover 50% of the water demand in 2025. Their permits distribution as of now is 2 billion cubic meters per year, as well as their planned extraction is to be 2.3 billion cubic meters, excuse me. It's just a giant development. It's really cool, I think. 80% of the population lives in the northern plains, and basically, I wanted to point out that it's studied intensively. This region, it's studied intensively all throughout the world. Most of the population is by the coast in the north, and as you can see from the diagram, they will be drawing from this resource in the south and drawing it to their most densely populated areas in the north. Okay, I want to go over their extraction rates, starting to combine all four countries. So as you can see, I wanted to circle, there's a lot of numbers here, but I wanted to circle the volume that is there available for these four countries as a total. As you can see, is over 450,000 in freshwater and storage, and then there's also a recoverable groundwater volume that's got to go through processes to get it from brackish to usable freshwater. And I also want to highlight the extraction from the countries from these resources. As you can see, Sudan and Libya were at the top, and Sudan is still very reliant on the Nile-Nubian basin, but Libya is really dominating that resource. Chad, unfortunately, is like I said earlier, they're financially and economically constrained to vie for this, to go get this resource. Egypt, their resources are mainly on the Nile River, and even though they're on the Nile River, they still take quite a generous take from this resource as opposed to the other three nations. So, the suggested agreement, I believe Libya has the largest stake in this source. And even though they were the ones to run, I think they had the most invested in this process. Basically, the GMMR, the Man-Made River Project, they have their whole life and country invested in that project. 95% of their world is invested in groundwater, and to me, I think that makes them the largest stake in the source. Basically, I believe a multilateral agreement between Chad, Sudan, and Libya should be formed. I think Egypt should get a side note, I guess, if you will, saying that they can use some of their surface water resources for their irrigation projects, as they do already. But if they're meeting 93% of their demand through the Nile resource, then I don't see why they couldn't draw back from what they do currently for the Nubian sandstone aquifer. Chad, they desperately need help with resources, and I believe if Libya and Sudan were to act as co-leaders in the supply and sustainable development, I think Chad could get the necessary resources they need. As I said before, I think Egypt's they could scale down for their irrigation methods. This, as I said before, is a huge contradiction, or a huge discussion, because there's the idea of you have fresh water available to a land, or is it the water underneath the land? I just said 38% of Egypt's water would not be allocated to them if it was described as underneath the land. That will easily grab the attention of Egypt, saying that their resources, and it's their resource right under their land. Why can't they use it as they like? 41% of that resource is fresh water for Egypt as well. I think these graphs really put the discussion into a very contradictory state, just because land under the land, or the aquifer under the land, is very contradictory to the uses of that aquifer. So that's all I got.
All right, any questions?
They may not be able to hear us, so repeat the question. As you made some suggestions on the allocation of this water, what are the criteria you would use to allocate water? You've talked a little bit about population, but there are a whole host of other criteria. So repeat that, and then...
The question was, what would my suggestion for criteria for allocating for this resource, I believe. Yes, it is. Okay. Well, I think the availability percentage of fresh waters is the main criteria I would use. And the reason I use that is because the land on which the aquifer, I really think it just has to do with because Egypt relies so much on the Nile. The other three states, especially Libya and Sudan and Chad too, they really need this resource, I think, as opposed to Egypt. And to Egypt, it's just a topping on their cake. I don't think riparian state land should be the decision for this aquifer. I think it should be according to. It's just neglecting Egypt in either way. That's unfortunate.
So is it need that you base it on? Because that's what you seem to be saying. How would you define need?
The question was how would I define need, and I would define need for the amount of people in a nation as opposed to how much water resources they have physically. Amount of fresh water available, freshwater resources. It's hard to say with it's very close. Basically, is what I'm trying to say is the water underneath the land and the water available of use. But I would say the amount of people, because all these countries are in a very dry climate, arid climate, and I think need is to answer your question. Need is the amount of people and how much water resources you have.
Any other questions? Any comments from the folks who did the presentation on the Nile Basin?
So Matt can probably turn that camera on when you're talking.
You want to repeat the question?
Well, I was just wondering if any of the folks who are in the group that did the presentation on the Nile Basin, if they have any comments. The one question that I have to them really pertains to the comment that you made about Egypt being so reliant on the Nile Basin that it should be able to entirely rely on the Nile as opposed to extracting from the Nubian sandstone aquifer.
I think the problem is with the high population of Egypt and the distribution, because towards the western part of it, where the aquifer, the Nubian sandstone aquifer lies, it is the only resource there for fresh water. So even if the country as a whole was relying so much on the surface water of the Nile River, but still they have to start from the scratch trying to figure out how to redistribute that surface water they have in order to give up their right of using the Nubian sandstone aquifer.
And it's a great argument. I can't say that. I wanted to go back to the map that said where, and I actually tried to put that river as close to where it is as possible on the map. I didn't just draw that in. Yeah, I mean, I totally understand. Like if we're, I guess, combating diplomats at a table. Yeah, I understand how the western part of that state could absolutely need that groundwater resources, and it's totally available. So it's a really it's a hard topic to piece out for 4 different nations as opposed to the one nation state of Egypt.
Yeah, you actually have the distinction of tackling one of the, I think, hardest issues in many amongst these many topics. One other concern on the Nile is that the upstream countries on the Nile River are really upset with Egypt and Sudan to some extent because they are effectively using 80% of the Nile's water. And then upstream countries now are wanting to reallocate that distribution based on the CFA, the Cooperative Framework Agreement that Ms. Hassan mentioned, which would mean reduction of surface water for Egypt in the future. And the question is how much of a reduction, and how does Egypt then make up that loss of surface water? So they are very interested in the groundwater, but you raise the exact problem of how much do they need it versus some of the other countries, and how do you allocate between them? So this is a really challenging problem. All right, any other comments or questions?
I wonder how much, and I could definitely look into this. Basically, throughout the studies I researched, it just said that Chad was sparsely populated, but I mean, you can tell that on the map diagram I provided, it's obviously more precipitation south of Lake Chad, and you know, it's a good possibility that aquifer resource is absolutely out of the question for the country of Chad, because if they're going to be living in that northeast part of the country anyways, they're going to have a hard enough time providing for themselves as it is. So, I mean, like I said, all I found was sparsely populated, but I mean, if they're living in North Chad, they should pick it up. It looks really dry on that map. I don't know if you're seeing that or not.
Yeah, it gets even worse than that because Lake Chad has been depleted tremendously. So even Lake Chad as a source of water for that country is now starting to be questionable. So this issue of trying to allocate water resources, I mean, that's the whole point of this class. How do we do it in a transboundary context? This is going to get much more challenging before we really figure this out.
All right, thank you.
Nice job. All right. Anything else from any other questions or comments? All right, then we're done for today. We'll see you next week.